I remember driving by the storage facility where he was at, to drive by and say our child is in there. It's not right at all, and it was very awful to have to wait.
Our children were frozen for 4 to 5 years, and the likelihood that many of them even escape the freezer is so few.
I had always wanted to adopt, and I had known about embryo adoption for a long time before we were married. Embryo adoption was something I'd heard about a long time. I've been always very opposed to IVF. IVF is in the same category and bucket as abortion for me. And so being opposed to IVF, seeing the need for embryo adoption.
We did know of embryo adoption, but a few years into marriage, we found out we were going to go through infertility for a while. And so adoption was always the first thought. We never thought of doing extra measures towards fertility treatments or anything like that, or IVF. We knew we wanted to adopt, and so we immediately started looking into all of the options, and embryo adoption really stuck out to us.
Of course, starting out, we were just, okay, how do we do this? How are we going to do this? It seemed like the Lord put us in a position where we had the opportunity to, and so now it's like, how are we going to do this? And first, the biggest thing was the financial aspect of it. We had great support from our friends and our family.
In our church.
In our church.
But it was walking into the unknown. No one knew what was happening, or really the depth of what it was.
There's not a lot of resources out there, so we met with a few people, some people in Oklahoma who had done it, met with our elders, some people at our church who had adopted and done regular adoption, just to figure out the whole adoption process. We were still kind of at the time figuring out whether we wanted to pursue embryo adoption or just born adoption, as I like to say. A lot of people hadn't even heard of it, or if they had heard of it, they didn't really know anything about it, or if they did know about it, they were, like our family, was nervous for us. It is a journey, it is a risky process to do. Because there's not a lot of resources, it kind of feels like you're just kind of start shooting in the dark, and you don't know the process and where it's going to end, but we know that we wanted to do it. Since we were set on adoption one way or another, whether embryo adoption or born adoption, part of that was figuring out what would be best. The Lord seemed in His providence to put us in a situation where that was good for us to do with infertility. We had a good support system around us. And so when we're approaching adoption, of course, there's the wide range of cost. And for us, regular adoption, whether domestic or foreign, is so pricey.
Hold on. You need to sit still.
You're good. You can move around a little bit. The normal domestic or foreign adoption is so pricey and costly, and embryo adoption was considerably less, a significant amount less to do. So that was a big factor in what made it possible and what helped us say, like, okay, this seems like something that we're able to do if we're not able to swallow the costs of a regular adoption and all that goes into that.
But we did do our fair share of fundraising. I sold cheesecakes for weeks on end and did bake sales, and then we were very blessed with fundraising from our local church that helped support. On top of that, we also did know of some insurances that did cover some of the fertility treatment in and of itself. And so a lot of the funding can be covered that way. But insurances typically won't cover a majority of standard IVF. It's a very expensive process. In an embryo donation and adoption, it's comparable to IVF in the latter part, meaning we're not creating embryos, but we're transferring and implanting embryos that are already created. And so it does cover the latter half of the quote-unquote IVF process generally. Not all insurance companies do. We were fortunate enough to pay for a very expensive insurance company that would cover some of that. But generally speaking, insurances don't cover the most expensive part of IVF, which is creating those human beings. Mentally, it is more difficult than it is physically, in my opinion. But there's a lot of physical difficulties in terms of daily injections, a lot of hormonal changes in a very quick amount of time. It's very emotional. But the mental game of, one, how are we, are we going to receive children? We didn't know who our donors were going to be for a while. And then the idea of having to guard your heart and stay so hopeful for them in terms of, will they even survive? We don't know. You're given a percentage of survival estimate with each child, and so you kind of have to prepare yourself for the worst and hope for the best. And ultimately, you have to kind of tell yourself ahead of time, no matter what happens, whether they survive or not, like, that child felt warmth and they had a home and they had a loving family for whatever amount of time they had. But to prepare yourself mentally for that is a really difficult thing. For me, it was very interesting, the change mentally that I had going into it with infertility. If anyone's gone through infertility, you can know what a mind, how tolling it can be on your mind in terms of it's all encompassing and you just desire to have a family. And then we adopted these children, and my mind totally switched. It wasn't just, I want to have one and have a family. No, I needed to save all my children. We needed to get them out of the freezer. And they needed to feel warmth. They needed to have a home. And so it was a very interesting change in my mind from, I just want to have a baby, to, these are my children and they're frozen and I need to get them out. It was a very different drive that I experienced, and much greater than any feeling you could have.
So it was nerve-wracking going into. It's an understatement to say that. We didn't know. So we had adopted 3 embryos, and I remember us sitting down having a conversation, just trying to mentally prepare, saying we could lose all 3 of these children. It could be very likely that happens, and trying to mentally be prepared for what's to come.
Even after she was born, saying, okay, we have another one. Like, having to mentally remember and think about the one that's still in the freezer and when can we get them, because they're just waiting. And so there's a mental game that goes on for years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was hard, having to wait. I remember driving by the storage facility where he was at as an embryo. He was there for a good while, and it was just surreal to drive by and say our child is in there. It's not right at all. It's evil and wicked, but it's very surreal to think about that. And then it was very just awful to have to wait. But there's relief and joy with having them here now. We did end up losing one of them, which was the hardest thing I've ever had to go through. But to have 2 of them here is still surreal. I'm like, how did we go through this whole process? And they're here now. God's been so good in it and keeping them safe and healthy. It's kind of relieving at the end. We started the adoption process back in 2021, and then we just had our last embryo here 3 weeks ago in 2024. So years of going from just waiting to be able to hold them, to think of how many embryos are out there that don't have parents. In our specific situation, these children were fortunate enough to have biological parents that cared and loved for them, and wanted to make sure that they were in the best situation possible. But for so many other embryos out there that don't have that time after we had adopted them, it makes that hit really hard, to think of how many millions are out there that
Are true orphans.
Yeah.
As for the joys, though, as we sit here and hold our 2 children, all of the joy surpasses anything that you experience physically, mentally, emotionally. The Lord is so good.
So many embryos conceived through IVF just get forgotten about. They're not wanted. The family, all right, we have our 3 kiddos that we want, but there's 18 more in the freezer. There's so many parallels between that and abortion, where the children are not wanted. They're not being loved as they ought to be. The whole IVF industry it has the guise of being a good thing. It's a great way to grow your family. It seems almost like it would be opposite of abortion. It seems like we don't want to murder your children, we want to give you children. And yet, so many children die through the IVF process. Perhaps more than abortion are being killed this way.
I think it deserves some context of IVF too, that many people aren't educated on in terms of IVF. Really, the grounds of it is not necessarily creating children, but destroying them. You mentioned, they get experimented on and genetically tested on, and maybe only one will survive out of 30 created. But on top of that, it's when you're done, when you freeze your embryos, you also have to state, like, if you don't want them anymore, do you want to throw them in the trash or not? And many people choose to just discard of them by literally throwing them in a biohazard bin. And, or like you mentioned, getting experimented on. The amount that are either frozen just for years, our children were frozen for 4 to 5 years. And the likelihood that many of them even escape the freezer is so few. And so it really is a concept of destruction, not creation, that we're trying to fight against.
And to be fair, IVF, when people are going to do it, they're just expecting a fertility treatment, and it seems like a lot of people don't even realize what's going on behind the scenes, or if they do, they haven't actually thought about that. Like you say life begins at conception, you believe that, okay, that means that they're human beings, that means they're my children. I think people just haven't thought through it all. You'll have to hold your tongue a lot. And you'll hear the success and failure if it results in pregnancy, and just you're going to have to ignore it because it's going to be successful. It does result in a pregnancy. To be able to know, like, financially not have to worry about that, I think that is such, for us that was a huge thing. For so many people, that is the thing that's blocking from pursuing this type of adoption or another type of adoption. But then also, okay, the legal paperwork, I don't know how to do all of that. So to have that all set up would be just huge.
It'd be so relieving. Like we've mentioned, we were very fortunate to have support from a local church and from fellow believers financially, but not everybody has that always. And so to have something where people have a go-to would be so relieving. You're so anxious and overwhelmed in the very beginning. Even to just know you have a local church body's support is, in and of itself, would be the most encouraging thing for a family just starting off. And you realize realistically, like, oh, it's way more doable than you think it is. Why am I hesitating? Like, we're already talking about, like, well, when can we do it again? Like, because it is so much more realistic. And that's unfortunate because you want adoption to be realistic in all areas. But when you hear genuinely, like, I can rescue an orphan that's been frozen for 10 plus years off of a couple of $1,000s, that feels like pocket change. Like, let me just do that. And so, I don't know. Realistically, when people can hear, like, you're willing to help pay for the small amount of money that it could be comparatively, I hope that would encourage many families. It's a little surreal for us to talk about now, too. We're very open, and we hope to continue to be open with our children that they were adopted. But even now we look at them and we're like, they're genetic siblings. They're not related to us at all. Like, that's just crazy. And they're just the most perfect little people. And she's energetic and she's smart. And to think that she was frozen for so long, we're so thankful for their parents that cared so much for them. But to give hope to some other families, like, those little babies that are sitting in freezers will turn into smart, funny, crazy little kids that are just so amazing. And so it's pretty surreal.
You almost forget the situation that they were in because it feels so normal after.
They're ours, yeah.
Her running around playing, like, sometimes you look at her and I just forget that she went through this, that he was just this little embryo. I have, through the process, they give you the pictures of them as embryos, and so I have the 3 of them that we adopted as embryos on my phone background, and to just look at that and then look at her and look at him is mind-blowing. It's wild, but so worth it.
There's only success moving forward with embryo adoption. There's no failure. If that baby doesn't survive or doesn't make it very long, you gave them a home for the smallest glimpse that they never would have experienced, and they would have died cold, and you gave them warmth, and they saw love, and they had a family for a very brief amount of time. And if God willing, that child is able to survive, there is no difference in your love between biological children and adopted children. Your life is forever changed, and it's always worth pursuing.
It will be successful, like you said. They'll have a home, they'll feel that warmth. And it's just a matter of if the Lord takes them early on or when they're grown up and old. That's the only difference.
It'd be great